Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Siri Hutcherson, and on behalf of the Education and Professional Development Committee, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar entitled Emerging Drug Trends. We are thrilled to have Dr. Willie Eggleston as our guest who will present the CE. Willie Eggleston is an assistant professor at the Binghamton University School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences and a clinical toxicologist at the SUNY Upstate Medical University. He received his PharmD from Wilkes University and completed a 2-year fellowship in clinical toxicology and emergency medicine at SUNY Upstate Medical University and with the Upstate New York Poison Control Center. He is a member of the American Board of Applied Toxicology's Board of Directors and a director of the Opioid Research Center for Central New York. His research focuses on reducing drug-related harms and cardiovascular toxins. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few quick points. For those of you who have technological issues during the presentation, please use the chat option to communicate with the office. Every effort will be made to assist in a resolution. For those who have questions that you would like to direct to the speaker, please use the question box or the chat option. The CE code for this program will be provided at the end of the program. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm happy to join you all here today virtually to talk about some emerging drug trends. I have nothing to disclose other than it was very noisy in my office, so I moved to my dining room, and I hope that the 2 dogs behind me cooperate and keep quiet throughout the presentation. So some objectives for today. We're going to talk about some emerging trends that we're seeing in the world of drug use, and kind of hopefully inform you as far as with regard to those trends, what are some of the toxicities we're seeing, in particular with kratom, Venebut, and marijuana, which are the 3 topics I'll focus on today, and then come up with a general plan when you do see these patients for understanding what toxicities to expect, how to manage them, or just to help your patients answer questions that they might have about some of these different products and that they're hearing about from friends or on the internet, so that you can have an informed conversation with them about them. The one thing I do like to just give as a caveat anytime I talk about new or emerging drug trends is that just because we're here today spending an hour talking about new drugs that we're seeing, it doesn't mean that the sort of like classic drugs that we're used to or we're familiar with have gone away. So oftentimes these are not in replacement of, but in addition to the typical drugs we're used to seeing. It's just that those typical drugs like cocaine, amphetamines, we kind of have an understanding of those. We know what they are, we know how they work. And so rather than spend time sort of reviewing those today, I felt it'd be better to focus on some of the newer trends that we're seeing, but they're still around. And that's evidenced by the number of overdose deaths we continue to see and the things that are driving those deaths. So most people who are dying from drug overdose in 2019 and in 2020 are dying from opioids, stimulants, mostly methamphetamine, and cocaine. And you can see that both fentanyl, heroin, and prescription opioids are all sort of driving the opioid deaths, but most of them are secondary to fentanyl exposures. So we still are seeing lots and lots of typical patterns of drug use. However, some of these newer supplements have entered the market, especially over the last decade. And one of the overarching trends or reasons that we're seeing this is that there are perceived benefits that people have when considering, do I want to use a typical drug that I'm more familiar with, or do I want to use one of these newer, potentially more unknown substances? And at least in my conversations that I have with patients, there seems to be 4 major factors that someone will consider when deciding whether or not they want to use one of these new and emerging substances. The first is cost. So if the product is available and it's available cheaper than what's already on the market, there's a good chance that it will be a popular item, right? This is the example of fentanyl. Fentanyl has become far and away the most commonly used non-prescription opioid in the United States because fentanyl is available so cheap. If you're selling opioids and you're selling them illicitly, you're going to be able to acquire a whole lot more fentanyl much cheaper than you are a prescription opioid product or something like heroin. And so fentanyl has sort of supplanted all other opioids on the marketplace. The next is going to be the consequences. So when we think about this product, what do we know about it? Do we know that it is legal? Do we know that it's sort of legal, maybe illegal, or is it clearly illegal? So if I have on my person, 3 kilos of cocaine with intent to distribute that, the law is pretty clear as to what the consequences for that are. However, some of these newer products like synthetic cannabinoids or research grade benzodiazepines, the law is a little less clear or catching up with regard to some of these products. And so when something is not illegal or the law is unclear, it may be a person may be more drawn to using that product because they may perceive the consequences to be less severe. The next is convenience. So how do I have to actually obtain this product? Do I need to go and find some person who is going to sell this product to me? I don't know this person. I have to go and expose myself to purchase it in an open public setting or in a someplace I'm not familiar with or comfortable with, or can I buy it on the internet? And so when thinking about convenience factor, certainly something that's available to purchase online, or maybe even to purchase in your local pharmacy, depending on the product, or in a local herbal supplement store, that would be more appealing than something that you have to buy in a less safe environment. And then the last piece is concealment. So how difficult is it to hide use of the product? And you can kind of think about this in 2 ways. The first being, how easy is it to hide from maybe people in your life? So if you're an adolescent or a teenager and you don't want your parents finding out you're using something, you're more likely to use things that are easier to conceal, which is why 11 to 13-year-olds, their drug of choice is typically huffing, right? They're going to huff whiteout or paint, things that are kind of inconspicuous. And so when you think about as they progress, then that would be choosing like a vape over a bong. So concealment is an important piece, but not only from parents, also from drug screens. So whether you have to get a drug screen for work or for a drug treatment program, you might have reason to want to use something that's not going to show up when you go to actually get that drug screen done. And this is a great reason why something like synthetic cannabinoids emerged, right? People who were looking for an alternative to marijuana that's not going to show up as marijuana on a urine screen. And that was why synthetic cannabinoids became so popular and remain relatively popular in the United States. And so whenever one of these products becomes available, another piece from a testing perspective is it going to show up in a normal testing screen, or are they going to be something where we're not going to have to, where you're going to be able to kind of circumvent that screening process? So those are sort of the 4 factors in general that we consider when we see one of these new products come to market, and kind of use those to decide, do we think this is something that's going to stick around, or is this sort of just like a flash in the pan? Someone used it, made its way onto the news, but we don't expect this to really be a long-term public health issue. So the 4 products that the 3 products I'm going to focus on today, they truly have demonstrated over the last few years that they're sticking around for a while. And so it's worthwhile knowing about what they are, how they work, how people are using them, and what toxicities to expect. The first one we're going to cover is Kratom. And so this is a photo that I took back in, probably like 2016 or 2017. I was at my cousin's wedding out in Santa Cruz, California, and there was like a small shop, and they had this sign outside, and so they were selling Kratom. And at that point, it was still a relatively newer substance, and at the time, seemed like it was going away. So I was like, I'll take a picture. That's kind of interesting. And now, fast forward to the fall of 2021, and Kratom is still around, and its use is growing in popularity. So what is Kratom? Kratom is a substance that is derived from a plant. The plant itself is the Nitrogenous speciosa. It doesn't grow well in the United States. So most of the product that is available is obtained from South Asian countries, predominantly like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand. And so the plant is typically grown there, and then product is imported either as plant or dried ground plant powder. And then that from there is what someone will use as their product of use. When you actually look at what's in the plant, that's where things get sort of interesting as far as why someone might use this product. So it's predominantly by dry weight, about 2/3 metragenine. And metragenine is the compound that people are interested in trying to use when they do buy the material, whether they're buying it as a plant or buying it as a capsule or a tea. There are a lot of other things in there though. So that metragenine is only 2/3 of the compound. There's a whole other third of these other alkaloids that we don't have great understanding of really how they work pharmacologically. But with regard to the metragenine, we do have a good sense of what it is and how it works. And that's because there's been a number of animal studies and radio-labeled human receptor studies to really help us understand what metragenine does when it enters the body. And so, at least in zebrafish, we know that if you take a bunch of zebrafish and expose those zebrafish over a period of time to morphine, enough time to develop dependence, and then you take that morphine away, all of those zebrafish go into withdrawal. Now, if you give those zebrafish back placebo, they remain in withdrawal. If you give those zebrafish back metragenine or kratom, their withdrawal symptoms are lessened. And subsequently, other animal studies have demonstrated similar effects, and human studies have demonstrated that indeed kratom does act as an agonist at opioid receptors. So for all intents and purposes, metragenine is an opioid compound, but it's an opioid compound that's currently not regulated per se in the United States. But it does have a little bit of an interesting sort of progression of clinical effects. And this probably has to do with those other compounds that I alluded to, that other third of the plant that we don't have a great understanding of what's in there and how it works. And so when you look at some of the dosing studies and some of the anecdotal reports of people using the product, what individuals report is that at low doses, somewhere in the range of 1 to 5 grams, it acts more like a stimulant. In fact, the majority of people who use the product in Southeast Asia use it just for that, at low doses for stimulant purposes. You can kind of think of it like an equivalent to coffee. They'll use it in the morning, they'll use it in the midday, either as a tea or they'll chew on the plant material. And at those low doses, it does predominantly seem to have stimulant effects. However, as you push the dose, the opioid effects seem to take over, and that's when we can start to see things like pretty significant CNS depression and potentially other opioid-like effects. And so it really, like the effects that you're going to see in a patient and the reason why someone is using it are really going to alter the way in which it's dosed. And that's important because people take it for a lot of different reasons in the United States. The most common being either pain management, a general classification of mood disorder, which has not been very well studied. It's probably mostly like anxiety, depression, and then to self-treat substance use disorder is the third reason. And so if you're using it for pain or substance use disorder, you might be using it at a higher dose to get those opioid effects, and potentially you might be at risk, more significant risk for toxicities. And we've seen interest grow over the last 6 or 7 years with regard to individuals who are looking to use kratom or at least want to know more about it. So this is Google Trend data. We can't draw any definitive conclusions from it, but it does show a pretty clear trend of at least increase in interest in what kratom is based on search volume. And you see there's sort of this huge spike back in the fall of 2016. And that is when the DEA came out for the first time and announced that they were going to be scheduling kratom because of its opioid properties and risks for toxicity. They felt it should not be available as an unregulated supplement. And so there was an initial decision to move it to Schedule 1. However, there was a lot of discussion at the time. Was that the right classification? Should we be scheduling it in a different level so that there's a more opportunity to do some research? Maybe this has a role in substance use treatment. Maybe this has a role in pain management. We really just don't know. And so the DEA at that time took a step back and said, all right, we'll just continue to monitor. And since then, that's sort of been where they've landed. They continue to monitor at this point. It remains sort of a pseudo-regulated substance in the US, but it's not a scheduled substance. And so it does remain widely available, and interest in use has continued to grow. Now, we don't have a lot of clinical data in the US, and that's important to know with Kratom. A lot of times you'll have patients asking about, is this a good drug for as an herbal supplement to help with my chronic pain? Is it a good drug to help with my substance use? And the true answer is we don't know. There is very limited clinical research into the efficacy and safety of Kratom use. But there is a little bit of data to at least help us understand how and why people are using it. So this is data from a substance use treatment program in Boston. And essentially what they did was they surveyed all of the patients who were enrolled in their program over a period of time and asked them, two questions. Have you used Kratom, and have you used non-prescription Suboxone? There are a few additional parts to the project, but these are the two main questions that are most helpful for us today. And so what we learned from this was two things. Number one, we learned that there's a decent number of people who are enrolled in treatment programs who have used Kratom, right? So about 25% of patients enrolled in the substance use treatment program had used Kratom in the recent past. And so there was interest in the community in using it. And then when you look specifically at that small chunk of people, those 25% of people who said, yes, I've used Kratom, almost every single one of them, about 95% of those people who had used Kratom had also used non-prescription Suboxone, really suggesting that these were individuals who were looking to treat opioid use disorder, but just didn't feel like, for whatever reason, they had access to medical resources. And so they were using either non-prescription Suboxone or Kratom as a way to try to self-treat their opioid use disorder. Now, again, we really don't know if Kratom works for this. We are lacking in clinical data, and we don't know if it's safe for this. But this seems to be one of the more popular reasons why people are using Kratom today in the United States. And when we think about, all right, so what are the downsides? What are the risks? Why are we talking about this today as a potential emerging drug trend? And there's really kind of two buckets of toxicity that we continue to see from Kratom use. And we published some data looking at the National Poison Data System, along with some of our colleagues at Upstate, as well as some of the medical examiner data from the state. And we did see some concerns as far as toxicities that were being reported. And so bucket one is sort of toxicities that we would expect given the opioid properties of the plant, given the opioid properties of mitragynine. And so we have seen cases of neonatal abstinence syndrome or neonatal withdrawal. We've seen cases of both substance use disorder and dependence developed with Kratom use chronically. We've seen Kratom withdrawal, CNS depression, certainly cases of respiratory depression at higher dosing. And so, the typical things you'd expect to see from an opioid, you can see with Kratom, it just seems to be at higher doses. And then the second bucket is things that are not consistent with opioid toxicity, things that I would not expect to see in a typical opioid toxidrome. And these might be related to those other things that are present in the plant. So we've seen really things, almost they look a little bit sympathomimetic, right? They're having seizures, they're tachycardic, they're agitated, hallucinations, and there are some isolated reports of hepatic toxicity as well. And so these are things where we're continuing to monitor those. And the treatment approach, how you would manage that patient, is obviously going to differ depending on what their presentation looks like. If they look like that typical opioid presentation, you're going to be administering naloxone and really keeping a close eye on their respiratory status. And if they look more like bucket number two, well, then I would manage it more like a typical amphetamine or cocaine patient, where benzodiazepines are probably going to be your best option. But doing so cautiously, knowing there's always that potential synergistic risk for respiratory depression, given the opioid effects of the Kratom itself. And one of the hottest areas of debate is, does Kratom kill you? Can Kratom cause death? And the preponderance of evidence at this point really suggests yes. There's a growing number of cases, both in the national FDA monitoring system, as well as reported by state medical examiners, that really suggest that, in rare cases, kratom probably is toxic enough to kill someone. It really just depends on the dose. Now, some of these cases involve co-ingestants and other drugs that make them more difficult to interpret, but there's enough evidence at this point to really say, there are circumstances under which kratom on its own probably can cause respiratory depression and death, similar to any other opioid. And so today it remains available throughout most of the US. Federally, it's not regulated at this point. It doesn't have like official dietary supplement status under the FDA. It just sort of exists in this no man's land of it continues to be sold and available. It's not technically an herbal supplement, but it's also not technically illegal. And so the next steps seem a little bit unclear at this point. Some states have taken steps. So the states in red have made kratom illegal at the state level, and the states in purple have made it illegal to sell the product to minors. However, you can still buy it online. You can still go over state lines and purchase it. I don't think that there's been a whole lot of change in availability based on legislation to this point. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with kratom. My 2 cents is that probably existing as a dietary supplement is not the right structure. I think that sort of when you think about the bar for safety in dietary supplements, I think of something like melatonin, and certainly the evidence that's available would suggest this does not meet that bar for safety. So whether it means eventually being available as a pharmaceutical product, depending on research, it exists in an infrastructure similar to how recreational marijuana exists. I don't know, but those are questions that I think that need to be answered because it's certainly not probably safe enough to remain on the shelf with other dietary supplements. All right, so we're going to shift gears here a little bit now and move into what you might be surprised to talk about as an emerging drug trend, because marijuana is certainly not a new drug, and we know a lot about it. However, the landscape with regard to marijuana and marijuana use in the United States has changed a whole heck of a lot since Colorado and Washington first legalized recreational marijuana about 12 or so years ago. And New York recently took the same step. And so we'll likely see recreational dispensaries opening in our state soon. And so I think it's good to take the time to kind of understand how the marijuana market and marijuana use patterns will likely change in New York State based on its status as a recreational substance, or as the New York State Department of Health likes to refer to it, adult use marijuana. And so you can see that really the landscape for marijuana use in the US has changed very drastically. So every state here in dark green has legalized recreational marijuana. The sort of like middle shade of green are states where it's available medically and recreational has been decriminalized. The next lighter shade of green is broad access to medical marijuana. And so you can see that in a lot of states, in fact, the majority of states, you can either go and get recreational or you can get medical where recreational is decriminalized. So access has increased significantly across the US. And as a result of that, the way people perceive marijuana and the number of people using it has changed. And one example of that is really the shift in perceptions, likely driven at least partly by access to medical marijuana. So medical marijuana in most states typically precedes access to recreational marijuana. Sort of the theory being that when medical marijuana becomes available, people start to equate this to medication, and so they feel it's safer, and because of that, they will change their opinions in general on marijuana as a whole, and so generally recreational legislation will follow suit. We saw this now here in New York, and so this is part of what's driving the discussion nationally, and we can see this in the data. So when you look at overall prevalence of marijuana use by state, and you compare states where medical marijuana is legal compared to those where it's not, you see that in those states where it's legal, we had a higher predicted prevalence of marijuana use when compared to states where it's not legal. And so what that suggests to us is that the access to medical marijuana really changes the way that people feel about marijuana and tends to lead to an increase in use. Now, that's not to suggest that wouldn't happen regardless. It's clear from the line in red, where states where marijuana was never available medically, that there's been a general increase in prevalence regardless. However, the increase in states where it was legal, is more rapid and to a higher degree than where they have not been legal. Now, some of the big things that we see that change once recreational marijuana becomes available in a state, or medical marijuana, is that it formalizes the production process. Right? It takes something that was happening in clandestine labs, in small farms, in people's basements, and it moves it into a more industrialized setting. And in doing so, it allows people to get more creative with growth and crossbreeding. And what this means is you can create a product that is it has higher concentrations of the desired substance. So whether that is THC or CBD, you can increase that concentration in the plant through a series of crossbreeding steps. And now this was already taking place a little bit before we even transitioned into a world where industrialized marijuana production existed. As evidence from data from the DEA. You can see, from the late 80s into the early 2000s, 2010s, we saw an increase in concentration in general of marijuana products. So higher concentrations of THC by dry weight in the plant. However, the process was sped up significantly once people were able to do this in a more formalized setting. And so this is data out of Colorado. And the point of this data was not to demonstrate the concentration, it was to validate a laboratory procedure. So essentially they took the same plant product, brought it to 6 different labs, they each tested it just to make sure that it was accurate and precise. But the thing that was more interesting to me about this data is if you look at the plant they were testing, you see that over here on the left, labs A through F suggest that the amount of THC per dry weight in that product is somewhere between like 18 and 25%. So much higher than the 14% we were at, just a few years prior. And so as people get better at growing and it's legal to grow, you're going to see higher concentrations of product. Some of the products available in Colorado and Washington today are north of 30%. So you just have these more potent plant products. And anytime you increase the potency of something, there's always a little bit of an increased risk for toxicity. Thankfully, with smoked marijuana, it's fairly easy to titrate a dose just because of the rapidity of the effects. So we don't see as many adverse effects, even with some of these higher concentration products in the acute use setting. But the big changes that we see are with regard to how people use the product itself. So once recreational marijuana becomes available in a state, most people no longer choose smoking marijuana as their primary method of use. They choose one of the alternative methods that become available along with recreational marijuana legislation. The first of which is edible products. So these can be gummies, they can be baked goods, there's chocolate, there's all sorts of ways that you can make edible marijuana products. And all these are is the THC from the plant is extracted, and ideally a fixed amount, a milligram amount, is put into each dosage form. But we know that that's not always super reliable. And then the product is ingested. But the pharmacokinetics of ingesting an edible are very, very different than the pharmacokinetics of smoking marijuana. And most people are not well aware of that. And so especially with adults who had previously used marijuana in their life and now were being reintroduced through edibles, or naive adults who now are more comfortable using edibles because they're legal, we certainly see a spike in adverse effects related to misadventures in dosing. And that's just because the kinetics are so drastically different from something that you smoke, right? So when you smoke marijuana, you're going to see a peak in about 5 to 7 minutes after that initial hit of the product. And so you can tell pretty quickly, oh, right, that's the dose that I want, or nope, that's too much, I'm going to stop, or it's not enough and I'm going to do it again. But it's much easier to dose titrate something that's smoked than something that's ingested. Because when you ingest an edible, most individuals don't have a good understanding of, what is 5 versus 10 versus 20 milligrams of THC. And they also have the little understanding of how long it truly takes to absorb that product. So in general, you're not going to see a peak for about 2 to 3 hours after that initial ingestion. And so if someone waits, 30, 45 minutes and they say, hey, I'm still not having the effects that I want, and they take an additional dose, and then they take an additional dose, and now all of a sudden that first dose is taking effect, and now they spend the next 12 to 16 hours in a really, really dysphoric state. And that certainly has led to increased ED visits and hospitalizations in states where recreational marijuana is legal, and something that certainly we want to make sure we're having discussions with our patients about. If we have a patient who are interested in using recreational marijuana, they might use an edible. Making sure they understand the pharmacokinetics is super important. Making sure that if they're a naive user, they use between like 5 and 10 milligrams their first time they're using, that those will all reduce their risk of having a dysphoric event. Now, the other big public health piece to this is making sure that patients understand they need to store edible marijuana products, ideally the same way they're storing prescription and non-prescription medications. So in a child-resistant package, up away where kids can't see them, can't get to them, ideally in a medication lockbox, because we do know that in states where edible marijuana is available, we see an increase in the number of kids who are unintentionally ingesting those edible marijuana products. We saw this in Colorado. Looking at their poison center and hospital data, you can see a clear increase in the number of cases reported to the poison center, as well as symptomatic children reporting to the hospital after the exposure. And that trend well outpaced national trends, right? So 2009 through 2015, yes, there was a small increase in the number of cases reported to U.S. poison control centers for edible marijuana product ingestions. However, you can see down there in dark blue with the triangles that increase, the rate and rise of that increase came nowhere close to what we saw in Colorado, right? Which you see in blue, light blue with the squares. There was a much higher incidence of cases of pediatric medical edible marijuana exposures in Colorado. And we can expect to see something similar in New York unless we have a very aggressive public health campaign to intervene before these products are available. Now, most of these kids just get sleepy. There are a few isolated case reports of at high doses respiratory depression, intubation. Most of the time, it's just some CNS depression. They do well with supportive care, but certainly still an exposure and hospitalization we would prefer to avoid. Now, besides edibles, the other place that we see increased use of recreational marijuana is with concentrates or butane hash oil. And all this is essentially the plant itself is either exposed to a hydrocarbon or a high pressure CO2 that allows it to exist in a liquid state. And that when that product travels through the plant, it extracts the active component, the THC, from the plant. And so the vehicle itself, when it makes it to the end of the process, is just a high concentration product containing the active component, the THC, that then is turned into these different hash concentrates for use. So what is different about these concentrates? Well, their name very accurately reflects what their internal components look like. That is to say, they have very high concentrations of the psychoactive component of the plant, the THC. And so this was the same study looking at accuracy and precision of laboratory instruments. But again, this was a concentrate product that was sent to 6 different labs. And you can see here from their data that concentrate had between 70 and 80% THC by dry weight. So now you've taken a product and you've more than doubled the potency of what you're going to find in the most potent plant products. And so again, there's always going to be a risk with higher concentrations of potentially overshooting and having toxicity. Now, similar to smoking, most of these products, people tend to inhale them through vapors, either through dabbing or through using a vape device. But in these cases, they're still having very rapid onset kinetics. And so most people are able to dose titrate effectively, and we don't see as much as far as like acute toxicity goes. How do people use these products? Well, the more conspicuous way is through one of these different devices here. These are just a few examples of how you can use the product. On the far right, you have something that looks more like a traditional bong that someone would use marijuana out of. And so you just take the concentrate itself, put it up in the glass bowl, and then they heat it. The vapors are inhaled off the other end of the device. The middle is a smaller, more portable version. You see they have the acetylene torch that's used to superheat the metal tip there on the device where the concentrate is placed, and then you inhale the vapors off the far left end of the device. And then the device over on the far left is a more expensive, precise tool, and this is designed to, the black box there is designed to be set to a very specific temperature with the goal of inhaling only, or with heating it only to the point where the THC volatilizes, but the terpenes or other organic compounds in the plant don't break down. And that helps to maintain the flavor profile so it tastes similar to like if you were smoking marijuana. So these are all higher end, more expensive products, and certainly not something that you could conceal from a parent if you were a teen or adolescent using one of these products, or at least not conceal as easily. Now, the one important public health trend from a treatment standpoint to be aware of with these is, even though, with vaping and smoking, we don't see a whole lot of adverse acute stuff. And with edibles, primarily dysphoria. But the one big thing we are seeing more of is with chronic use, patients are at increased risk for cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome is sort of like a refractory cyclical vomiting, where they will have sort of this prodrome of abdominal discomfort over a few days. Then the vomiting will begin. It does not get better. They come to the ER, they get antiemetics, they don't work. Eventually, if they stop using the marijuana for a day or two, the symptoms start to mitigate. But then when they reintroduce the marijuana or use again, the hyperemesis comes back. And so it becomes this cyclical vomiting syndrome that is really refractory to most of the antiemetic treatments we have available. Now, one of the things that a good question to ask in the patient's history, if they are having recurrent vomiting, they're not responding to typical therapies, certainly ask about marijuana use and ask if anything at home is making it better, particularly hot showers. The process by which this is mediated is likely through substance P. And one of the ways you can sort of overwhelm the system and make the symptoms better is by overstimulating that receptor pathway. So one way you can do that is with high temperature. And so hot showers will actually make their symptoms better. And for this same reason, there's a little bit of preliminary data looking at abdominal placement of capsaicin ointment to try to alleviate the symptoms as well. That research is still very much in its early stages, but has shown some promising results as far as mitigating some of these symptoms. But ultimately, the only real treatment is, not using marijuana. And so it can be a tough discussion with the patient. And there's definitely not a whole lot of data or solid treatment programs out there for marijuana use disorder. And so it might be a difficult process for that patient to work through. Now, the other toxicity, at least to be familiar with, it's one that we haven't seen as much of in recent months, probably because of the effective mitigation efforts that were put in place. But the other way you're going to see predominantly, teens and people in their 20s using these concentrate products is through a vaping device. So someone who's using a Juul pod or other vaping device for nicotine, you can put a cartridge in there that has THC as well. And you can, it heats it to a high temperature and you inhale the vapors, and it works the same way as those other vaping devices that I showed you earlier. And we've certainly seen an increase in the number of middle school age and high school age students who are using vape products. So almost a third of 12th graders report using a vape product. And I don't know that I buy into the data over on the right? So you see about 30% of 12th graders say they're using a nicotine-containing product, about 10% marijuana or hash oil, and about 50% of them say they're using just flavoring. There are very, very few just flavoring products available on the market. My sort of guess is that either these individuals don't want to be forthcoming on a survey about what they're using, or they just truly think they're using flavoring because a friend told them that, and they're not. They're using a marijuana or nicotine containing vape. And this was a problem back, this was pre-COVID, but fall of 2019, we did see a big influx in the number of people in their teens and 20s developing sort of this bilateral, horrible respiratory syndrome that was requiring, in many cases, ICU admission as well as mechanical ventilation. We were pretty heavily involved with the management of this through the Poison Center. A few of my colleagues like Gina Marafa and Nick Naka really worked up a lot of this data with the New York State Health Department and FDA to try and identify and manage this sort of initial outbreak. And some of the things we learned from this outbreak were, number one, about 8 in 10 people who developed e-cigarette or vaping associated lung injury did so after using a THC containing product. Most of the THC containing products they were using were being obtained from informal sources, meaning, they got it from their friend Tim, who got it from someone else that made it in their basement, and not from like your local vape shop. And we also found through a number of collaborations with our Department of Health, as well as the FDA and CDC, that the culprit in most of these cases was likely an additive that was put into the product called vitamin E acetate, which you might be familiar with as a dietary supplement or as a cosmetic product. And in those cases, it's very, very safe for use. But in the lungs, it's not so safe for use. So most of these cases, 48 out of 51 of the cohort tested all had vitamin E acetate in their bronchial, alveolar, lavage fluid, which is really ultimately how this was identified as the culprit product. And when you look at the product itself, it makes sense as to why this happened. So the picture over on the right, the far right, the device with the white top, that is a THC oil. And the device just to the left of it with the clear top, that is just vitamin E acetate oil. And so you can see they look essentially the same. And so what people were doing, or likely doing, was they were cutting their THC vape product with the vitamin E acetate in order to, bulk up your volume and make, 2 times, if not more than 2 times profit by selling those products. And the consequence of that was when vitamin E acetate enters the lungs, it interferes with the normal production of surfactant that's needed to keep your alveoli open and allow for normal respiratory effort to occur. And once this was identified and public health measures were put in place to mitigate the issue and people were made aware of the problem, we did see a rapid decline in ED visits. So this is sort of how we got to the conclusion that it was likely vitamin E acetate. However, the huge caveat to all this is that all of the resources that were put in place to monitor all went away in February because everything was redirected to COVID. And so the CDC has not had any other emergency operations centers established for revisiting this. And so, we kind of are operating under the premise that it's no longer an issue, but something that we're certainly keeping an eye on. And, the other big piece to all of this is we still don't know what is the impact of long-term vaping on lung disease. And so that's a big, huge question mark that remains unanswered, and something that we're going to continue to get more data on as more and more people are using these vape products, either for nicotine, THC, or a combination of the two. And then the one last sort of wrinkle to marijuana that's come up in the last 3 months or so is derivatives that are being sold as legal alternatives to marijuana, including in New York State, that are have grown with a lot of popularity, mostly in states without recreational marijuana. So I'm very interested. This is something that probably long-term is not going to be something we see in New York because recreational marijuana will become available in the near future. And so I can't imagine that someone, if they have the option to use marijuana, would go and seek Delta 8 or Delta 10. But certainly in states where it's not widely available, we are continuing to see use. We don't know a lot about Delta 8, Delta 10, or the other derivatives as far as like what is their dose response and effects and how do those compare to the typical Delta 9 THC that's in marijuana. But the one concerning thing that we do know, and at least something that a discussion you can have with your patients if they have questions about Delta 8, is that Delta 8 is not it does not occur in high concentrations during regular marijuana growth. So like you can't go to a marijuana plant and extract Delta 8 and have enough to do anything with. So most of the Delta 8 that we're seeing is being produced through a loophole where people will extract the CBD from hemp, and then they will heat it in an acid at a high temperature over a period of time. And that will change the structure of hemp enough that it turns into Delta 8 THC. And so with regard to the Delta 8, we know it's mostly being produced from CBD. That process is not well studied. It's not regulated. And so if you actually take the final product and run it through like a GCMS, you'll see there is some Delta 8 there, but there are also dozens of other unidentified peaks. And we don't know what those are. They could be contaminants, they could be non-consequential byproducts. So there truly is a lot of risk with using the product and a lot of unanswered questions. So we'll see where this goes. New York State sort of made a law that kind of made it illegal, but left a big, wide open loophole that I'm not sure how they're going to address. So if this continues to remain popular, these are all questions we'll have to revisit. And then I was just quickly going to touch on CBD. So this looks to the normal eye like a marijuana plant. And it's a special species that does not produce THC, or the psychoactive component. These just produce CBD. This is hemp. And so the Farm Bill of 2018 made hemp legal in the United States. So if you're a farmer, you can grow hemp. You don't need any oversight. As long as it doesn't crossbreed and turn into marijuana, you're fine to produce hemp. Now, what the bill didn't address was it didn't address the legal status of CBD. And so the DEA about a year ago came out and said, all right, because hemp is no longer considered illegal, it's not a scheduled substance, this has nothing to do with us. So any hemp growth or CBD extraction and production is not currently under the purview of the DEA. Where things got kind of weird, though, is that we know that CBD exists as a pharmaceutical product, right? CBD is Epidiolex. You can be prescribed CBD for severe pediatric refractory epileptic diagnoses like Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. And so technically, if something's available as a prescription product, it's not supposed to be also available as like a dietary supplement. And so the FDA has been asked to provide some advice on this, some regulations for this. They've been working on this for about 3.5 years now, but have not put out anything definitive as of yet. So right now, anything that's CBD that's not Epidiolex is not legal, but it's also not illegal. So it's not really clear where that stands. Again, Epidiolex remains available as a prescription substance, but CBD, for all the other reasons why people take CBD, whether buying it for themselves or for their pets, the legality of that does remain questionable. But we do know there's a lot of interest in using this for other indications, right? So as of about a couple of weeks ago, there were just over 260 studies registered on clinicaltrials.gov looking at cannabidiol as a primary treatment option. And those include pain, anxiety, among a whole host of other potential areas of interest. And so we're going to probably see eventually more prescription products available. And so this is, again, pushing the importance of FDA having to give some guidance on what to do with these non-prescription products. Because you can still buy it in lots of foods. I was just up a couple of weekends ago in Ithaca, and I was at a college town bagel, and they had like a lot of CBD containing tea and other ointments. It's like you can still buy it. And the FDA isn't really cracking down except on like large scale operations. So for some of the larger companies, they have sent cease and desist letters reminding people that, these indications like that they're selling these for are not approved in any way, shape, or form. And so it's just going to continue to sort of be this game of like, they're going to enforce it when they want to and not enforce it when they don't feel the need to, until there's clear regulations that are sent down for people to actually use. And then I saw there was a question in the Q&A about drug interactions. It's a great question. And it's one where we still don't have a whole lot of data. So I just provided one example here. And this is from just a single patient using CBD. So take this with a grain of salt, but this was a patient who was on CBD and enrolled in on tacrolimus to prevent organ rejection after a transplant, and entered a CBD study. During the placebo phase, had been stable on tacrolimus for many, many years. Troughs were non-toxic. And then once entered the dosing phase of the study, the tacrolimus trough levels increased fairly significantly. So, there are new data coming out still on drug interactions. There's some potential in combination with other CNS depressants, in particular with clobazam. So the research on this is really very much in its infancy, because all we have is the pre-market data, which has the methodology that is used for that has a lot of holes. We have data in post-market in kids using this for refractory epilepsy, but they're not on a whole lot of other prescription drugs. So it's going to continue to be sort of a wait and see type scenario. So any patient starting CBD, certainly having that conversation with them about the potential for drug interactions is important. And then the last substance that I'll cover in the last couple of minutes here is a product called Phenibut. Phenibut remains available as an herbal supplement in the United States. It was actually developed as a prescription drug in Russia, and still is available as a prescription drug in Russia today. It was developed for their space program because they needed to provide an anxiolytic to astronauts that would allow them to, cope with the anxieties of being in a giant flying metal box in space, but also be able to still pilot that flying metal box in space. So like benzos weren't an option for them. And so the Phenibut is supposed to provide anxiolysis without a whole lot of sedating effects. And, there's been some interest of use in the US. It's been waning in recent years, but we still see patients in the hospital, a couple a month for either Phenibut toxicity or Phenibut withdrawal. And when you look at it structurally, it looks a lot like the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And so it makes sense that it's, mostly a CNS and respiratory depressant. So if you take GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, you add a ring to it, that's Phenibut. And the ring's there because if you take a bunch of GABA as pills or tablets, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So all your patients who are using GABA supplements, you can tell them they're just wasting their money because the GABA is not bioavailable. But if you add a ring, then it crosses the blood-brain barrier as Phenibut. And if you actually stick a chloride group on your Phenibut ring, that's baclofen. So Phenibut toxicity is very, very similar to baclofen toxicity. It's just far less potent. So you would need much bigger doses to see the same effects. But in big doses, we do see the same effects. We see the CNS depression, we see the respiratory depression. Care is mostly supportive. There aren't any antidotes or things like that. But if you do have a patient presenting with Phenibut use or toxicity, I'd certainly be very much monitoring their respiratory status and making sure if they're clinically getting worse, that is somewhere where they may require an advanced airway. And then on the other end of this, we have seen an increase in the number of withdrawal cases as well. The withdrawal looks a lot like baclofen withdrawal, just a little bit less severe. So, they're hyperadrenergic, they're tachycardic, they're hypertensive, they're sweaty, they're anxious. And we've actually had some success using a couple of weeks of baclofen tapers in these patients because you can't really reliably do a Phenibut herbal supplement taper. And so that's sort of been our approach thus far. And we did publish one of our cases of managing this with a baclofen taper. So just one option to consider if you do have a patient with a Phenibut withdrawal. As always, if you're seeing these toxicities, please be sure to report them using FDA MedWatch. It's really important FDA has this data. Otherwise, they can't make any decisions or actions without the information. And you can always call your local poison control center. For those of you who are north of Westchester County, that's us at the Upstate New York Poison Center in Syracuse, New York. For those of you that are south of Westchester County, that's our colleagues at the New York City Poison Center. But you can always call us. We're there 24/7, free. It's a free call, and happy to answer any questions that you have about any of these products. I'll check out the Q&A and see if there are things that I haven't answered yet. And I will do my best to answer those. And if there are additional questions, I'll be happy to check out those as well. I see there's a question about hemp in Wisconsin. I'm not sure about Wisconsin state law with regard to hemp, but federally it has to have less than, I believe it's either less than 0.03 or less than 0.02% THC. It can't, if there's more than that, it's considered marijuana. And so one of the dangers is, of course, that if you have a whole hemp field and you're growing it outside and it cross-pollinates with like a marijuana plant, your whole hemp field is probably going to turn into a marijuana field. So there's a lot of sort of gray area around how that's monitored.
All right. Well, thank you, Willie. That was a wonderful presentation. And there's been quite a few questions and chats in the chat box. I think that in the interest of time, I will provide the codes for the program right now. So the use of the CBD oil as a topical for hair loss. Is there something that you can provide, Willie?
I'm sure people have used it for that indication. As I said, there's not, outside of Epidiolex for those indications for which it's currently available, there's not a lot of therapeutic data about CBD. There's a lot of ongoing research. I would just say with regard to CBD oil, whether or not it does anything, we don't know. Whether or not it's safe, likely, right? The dermal bioavailability is fairly low. And so I wouldn't be worried about something like drug interactions or toxicities like I would in larger doses of oral CBD.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then the question is about the cost of CBD, whether there's a future that the dose of one in terms of versus prescription, how would that impact its use? Do you see a future where the dose of CBD is less than prescription items that will emerge?
Yeah, you know, I think as far as CBD goes, I think the cat's out of the bag as far as the FDA probably being able to regulate the non-prescription products because they are so ubiquitous at this point. I really think you're going to see a framework that looks something like the recreational marijuana framework, where it's going to probably be available. There will probably be regulations as far as, you know, what percentages or doses you can have in some of these dietary supplements. But I would be impressed if the FDA stepped in and pulled those products from the market with how things look already.
Okay. I think if there's any other questions, please put them in the question and answer. I will, at this point, repeat the codes in case that was missed, and it's also in the general chat. The codes for pharmacists